My mom canceled my wedding, saying, "We're not funding this circus." My name is Olivia Reed. My mother's words cut sharper than glass. I was standing in her living room, the one with the cold marble floors and the furniture no one was ever allowed to sit on. My wedding binder was clutched in my hands. It was heavy with 3 years of dreams, fabric swatches, pressed flowers, and pictures of smiling couples I'd torn from magazines. I was 26 years old, and I was about to marry the only man I had ever truly loved. I had just come from a final meeting with our caterer. The excitement was a warm buzz under my skin. My fiancé, Ethan, had already left for his job at the high school, and I'd stopped by my parents' house on the way home. Eager to share the last little details, my mother, Veronica Reed, was sitting in her favorite wingback chair, the one that faced the perfectly manicured garden. She held a cup of chamomile tea, her posture as flawless as the porcelain in her hands. She didn't look up at me. She just stared out the window at a world she had arranged to her liking. "We're not funding this circus," she said. The words were so quiet, so devoid of anger that for a moment I thought I had misheard. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall suddenly felt deafening. The air in the room, which was always kept at a precise 68 degrees, felt like it had dropped to freezing. Then my sister Grace, who was perched on the arm of the sofa like a porcelain doll, looked up from her phone. A slow, satisfied smirk spread across her face. It was a look I had seen my entire life, usually right before my world was about to shrink a little more. "Maybe next time you'll choose someone appropriate," she added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I looked from my sister's triumphant face to my mother's rigid back. I saw the wedding binder in my hands, the one filled with all my simple, happy plans. A circus. That's what my love, my future, my happiness was to them. An embarrassing, low-rent show. Something inside me, a fragile part that had spent years hoping for their approval, finally broke. But it didn't break into tears. It shattered and reformed into something hard and clear, like a diamond. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I closed the binder with a soft click. I looked directly at the back of my mother's head and said one word: understood. That was the moment everything changed. They thought they had humiliated me, broken me, put me back in my place. They thought I would come crawling back, begging for their forgiveness and their money. But they misunderstood my silence. It wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of a war they didn't even know had been declared. 3 weeks later, my silence would become the one thing they never saw coming. Growing up in the Reed household was like living in a museum. Everything was beautiful, everything was valuable, and everything was for display. Our family's version of love came with fine print and an invisible price tag. Love wasn't a feeling, it was an asset. It was something to be polished and shown off at the right parties, something that appreciated in value when paired with the right name or the right bank account. My mother, Veronica Reed, was the curator of this museum. She ran our home on King Street in Charleston like a prestigious country club, elegant, cold, and based entirely on reputation. Her warmth was reserved for guests she wanted to impress. With me and my father, she was efficient and demanding. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her disapproval was a silent, heavy thing that could suck all the air out of a room. A perfectly arched eyebrow or a faint, tight-lipped smile was enough to tell you that you had failed. My father, Charles, was one of her prized exhibits. He was a successful architect who designed beautiful, empty buildings that won awards. At home, he was just as empty. He was a ghost in a well-tailored suit who rarely spoke unless it was to agree with my mother. I used to think he was just quiet, but as I got older, I realized he was complicit. His silence was his consent. He stood by and watched as my mother measured out her affection in teaspoons, always giving the bigger portion to my sister. And Grace? Grace was their masterpiece. She was 2 years older than me, prettier than me, smarter than me, and most importantly, more ambitious than me. She was everything my mother wanted in a daughter. Grace understood the family business. Appearances were everything. She went to the right schools, joined the right sorority, and dated the right men. She was a mirror reflecting my mother's own ambitions back at her. I was a window my mother preferred to keep curtained. I remember one Christmas when I was 10. I had spent weeks working on a gift for my mother, a small hand-painted jewelry box. I had used all my allowance money to buy it and had painstakingly painted tiny sea turtles on the lid because she'd once mentioned she liked them. On Christmas morning, I gave it to her, my heart pounding with hope. She opened it, looked at the turtles, and gave me a thin smile. "How quaint, Olivia," she said before setting it aside to open Grace's gift. Grace had used our father's credit card to buy her a silk scarf from a designer boutique. My mother wore that scarf for the rest of the day. My little box was put in a drawer and never seen again. That was the pattern of my life. My efforts were quaint. Grace's were impressive. When Grace got married to a man whose family owned a shipping company, my mother was ecstatic. She threw a garden wedding that was featured in the local society pages. There were articles about the union of two of Charleston's finest families. My mother spent a year planning it, obsessing over every detail, from the imported French lace on Grace's dress to the string quartet that played Vivaldi. It wasn't a wedding, it was a coronation. And my mother was the queen mother, beaming with pride. My wedding was never going to measure up. I wasn't marrying for status or for a feature in a magazine. I was marrying Ethan. I met Ethan in college. He wasn't from a fine family. His father was a mechanic and his mother was a nurse. He didn't want to be a banker or a lawyer. He wanted to help people. Now he was a high school counselor, working with troubled kids, guiding them, listening to them. He was steady and kind and patient. When I was with him, I felt like I could finally breathe. He didn't see me as a project to be improved or a reflection of his own ambition. He just saw me. He loved me. That's all I ever wanted. But to my family, his kindness was a liability. It was weakness. When I first brought him home for dinner, the polite interrogation began. My mother asked him about his 5-year plan. My father asked him about his investment portfolio. Grace asked him if being a counselor was emotionally draining, her tone suggesting it was also financially draining. Ethan answered every question with calm sincerity. He wasn't ashamed of who he was or what he did. Later that night, after he'd left, my mother cornered me in the kitchen. "Olivia, you can't be serious about him," she said, her voice low and urgent. "He has no ambition. He's a public servant. Think of our reputation." "I love him, Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She sighed, a long, weary sound, as if my simple happiness was the heaviest burden she had to bear. "Love doesn't pay the bills, darling. And marrying for love in our world is a scandal." I should have known then. I should have seen that this was never going to end well. But a part of me, the little girl who painted sea turtles on a wooden box, still believed that one day she might see me. One day she might be proud of me. That hope was a dangerous thing. It was that hope that led me right into her trap. When my mother, after months of cold silence about my engagement, suddenly offered to help with the wedding planning, I was foolish enough to feel a surge of relief. I thought naively that maybe she had finally accepted Ethan. Maybe she saw how happy I was and wanted to be a part of it. We were in her sitting room, the same one where she would later shatter my world. She had a folder of her own, filled with glossy brochures for venues that were far outside my budget. "I know you and Ethan are trying to do this on your own," she began, her voice unusually gentle. "And I admire that, I do. But a wedding is a lot to handle. There are so many payments, so many deposits to keep track of. Why don't you let me handle the financial side of things? It will make it so much easier for you. You just focus on the creative details, darling. My treat." She made it sound like a gift, an act of generosity. She said she would manage the vendor contracts and make the payments directly from a family account to simplify the paperwork. I was so desperate for her approval, so tired of the tension, that I agreed. I thanked her, feeling a warmth spread through my chest for the first time in years. I saw it as an olive branch. I didn't realize it was a weapon. For the next few weeks, everything seemed perfect. My mother would call to give me updates. "The deposit for Ivy Oaks is paid," she'd say. "The florist has been booked and a down payment has been sent." She sounded engaged, even happy. I let myself believe the fantasy. I let myself believe we were a normal mother and daughter, planning a wedding together. The first crack in the facade appeared a month before the wedding date. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was at my apartment, addressing invitations when the phone rang. It was a woman named Sarah, the events coordinator from Ivy Oaks Garden, our dream venue. "Hi, Olivia," she said, her voice laced with confusion. "I'm just calling to follow up on your cancellation. We have another couple interested in your date, so I wanted to confirm you won't be needing it. I felt the pen slip from my fingers. Cancellation? I didn't cancel anything. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, well, we received an email and a formal cancellation notice last week. It said due to unforeseen family circumstances, the wedding was off. Your signature was on the form. My blood ran cold. Can you send me a copy of that notice? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. She agreed. A minute later, an email landed in my inbox. I opened the PDF attachment. There it was, a cancellation form for Ivy Oaks Garden. And at the bottom, in perfect flowing script, was my name, my signature, except I hadn't signed it. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a flawless imitation of my handwriting. A forgery. The kind of forgery someone could only pull off if they'd had years of practice. Maybe from signing school permission slips or birthday cards. Before I could even process it, my phone buzzed again. It was our florist. Then our caterer. Then the photographer. One by one, they all told me the same story. They had received cancellation notices, all with my forged signature. Every vendor thought I had canceled my own wedding. My dream, so carefully built, was being dismantled piece by an invisible hand. But I knew whose hand it was. I left my apartment in a daze and drove straight to my parents' house. I didn't call first. I walked in using my old key and found my mother in the living room, arranging roses in a crystal vase. She looked up when I entered, a placid, questioning smile on her face. I held up my phone, showing her the forged document. Why? I asked. My voice was tight, strained. Why would you do this? She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She simply took a rose, snipped the end of its stem with a small pair of silver scissors, and placed it perfectly in the arrangement. Her calmness was more terrifying than any rage. It's for your own good, Olivia, she said, her eyes finally meeting mine. They were as cold and clear as ice. You're marrying beneath yourself. I couldn't stand by and watch you ruin your life. This will be a difficult lesson, but one day you'll thank me. Grace appeared in the doorway behind her, drawn by the confrontation. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, a smug look on her face. She's right, you know, Grace said. We're just protecting you from your own bad decisions. I stood there, surrounded. It wasn't just a cancellation. It was a coordinated attack. They had discussed it, planned it, and executed it together. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, it felt like it would swallow me whole. I left that house shaking, but I didn't cry. Crying was what they expected. Crying was weakness, and I couldn't afford to be weak anymore. The hurt was a physical thing, a crushing weight in my chest, but underneath it, a new feeling was taking root. A cold, hard resolve. I drove home, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I walked into my apartment, past the stacks of useless wedding invitations. I sat down, opened my laptop, and created a new document. At the top, I typed a single heading, evidence. Then I started to make a list of everything she had touched and everything I was about to reclaim. When Ethan came home that evening, he found me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. The lights were off, save for the blue glow of my laptop screen. He saw my face and knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. I told him everything. I told him about the calls, the forged signatures, and the final chilling confrontation with my mother and sister. As I spoke, his face transformed from confusion to disbelief, and then to a slow burning fury I had never seen in him before. Ethan, the gentlest man I knew, looked like he was ready to burn the world down for me. That's it, he said, his voice a low growl. We're calling a lawyer. We'll sue them for everything. Forgery, breach of contract, emotional distress. Everything, Liv. We will destroy them. He reached for his phone, ready to act, ready to fight for me. A part of me loved him more in that moment than I ever had before. But another, colder, more calculating part of me put a hand on his arm to stop him. No, I said, my voice steady. Not yet, he looked at me confused. What do you mean, not yet? They forged your name. They sabotaged our wedding. They can't get away with this. I know, I said, looking from his angry, loving face to the list on my screen. But revenge doesn't need rage, Ethan. It needs precision. They think I'm a hysterical, emotional mess right now. They expect me to scream and cry and eventually give up. We're not going to do what they expect. I needed to understand the whole picture. My mother's cruelty had always seemed purely emotional, a tool to control me. But this was different. It was methodical. It was criminal. There had to be more to it than just her disapproval of him. Over the next few days, I channeled all my grief and anger into a single focus, finding out why. I started with the payments my mother had claimed to make. I had copies of the original contracts with the vendors, which listed the deposit amounts. My mother had told me she was paying them from a family account. I needed to know which one. I went through old bank statements that my parents had given me years ago, the ones I had filed away and forgotten about. Most were from standard checking and savings accounts. But then I found a folder tucked away at the very back of my filing cabinet. It was thin, with only a few old statements inside. The account name was strange. Olivia Reed Custodial Account. I barely remembered it. My parents had told me it was a small savings account my grandfather had opened for me for college, and that the money had all been used for tuition. The last statement in the folder was from over 5 years ago. On a hunch, I looked at the routing and account numbers. Then I pulled up the initial deposit receipts from the vendors, the ones my mother had so helpfully forwarded to me weeks ago as proof of payment. I compared the numbers. They matched. My heart started beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The payments she had made to the vendors, the ones she had used to gain control of my wedding, hadn't come from her account. They had come from an account that was, at least in name, mine. Why? Why would she use that specific account? It made no sense. There was only one person who might have the answers. Our family had used the same law firm for decades. The senior partner, Ms. Eleanor Carter, was an older woman who had been my late grandfather's personal attorney and friend. She was sharp, discreet, and one of the few people my mother couldn't intimidate. I found her number and called her office. Her secretary put me through immediately. "Olivia, dear." Ms. Carter's voice was warm but professional. "It's been a long time. How are you?" "I'm not sure, Ms. Carter," I said, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "I have a strange question for you. I need to know about an old custodial account set up by my grandfather. It's in my name." I explained the situation, that my mother had used it to pay wedding deposits and that I didn't understand why. As I spoke, there was a profound silence on the other end of the line. It stretched for so long I thought the call had been disconnected. Finally, she spoke, and her voice had lost all its earlier warmth. It was now heavy with a gravity that terrified me. "Olivia," she said slowly, carefully, "you have no idea what's been happening with that account, do you?" That night, I met Miss Carter at her quiet, wood-paneled office downtown. The building was empty, the only light spilling from her doorway into the dark hall. She had a thick, leather-bound folder on her desk with my name on it. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Your grandfather was a very wise man, Olivia," she began, her sharp eyes studying my face. "He was also very perceptive. He loved your mother, but he was not blind to her anger, or to your father's passivity." She opened the folder. The first document she pushed across the polished mahogany desk was titled, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement." "Your grandfather didn't set up a simple savings account for you," she said gently. "He established a trust fund. He wanted to ensure you had a piece of the family legacy that your mother couldn't control." My eyes scanned the page. My hands began to shake. The number printed in the formal legal text seemed to leap out at me. $275,000, I couldn't breathe. $275,000? I whispered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. I don't understand. My parents told me it was all used for college." Ms. Carter gave a sad, knowing sigh. That was the first lie. The trust stipulated that the funds were to be managed by your parents as trustees, yes. But they were for your benefit and your benefit only. "And most importantly," she said, tapping a specific clause with her pen, "the full remaining balance was to be released to you, in your sole control, upon one of two conditions: your 30th birthday or the date of your legal marriage." The room began to spin. Marriage. The word echoed in my mind. The trigger. The account my mother was using. I started, my voice trailing off as the horrifying truth began to dawn on me. "Was the trust account," Ms. Carter finished for me, "the one she was supposed to be protecting for you. Instead, she and your father have been treating it as their personal slush fund for years." She then laid out the bank statements. Page after page of withdrawals, transfers, and payments stretching back over a decade. It was a meticulous record of their betrayal. I saw a $25,000 withdrawal from 3 years ago. The memo line read, "Kitchen remodel. Our kitchen was remodeled 3 years ago. I saw a transfer of $50,000. The memo, seed funding, G. Reed Designs. That was the money they had given Grace to start her failing boutique. They hadn't given it to her. They had stolen it from me and presented it as a gift. There were charges for country club dues, for my father's new car, for my parents' anniversary trips to Europe, the ones they sent postcards from, telling me to work hard so one day I could travel too. Every luxury, every advantage they gave Grace, every part of the perfect life they paraded in front of Charleston society, it was all funded by me, by the money my grandfather had left to secure my future. They had been draining it, bit by bit, for years. They had stolen over $150,000. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. If I had gotten married, I said, looking up at Ms. Carter, my eyes burning but still dry, the trust would have been dissolved. The final balance would have been transferred to me. An audit would have been triggered to close the account. Exactly, she confirmed. The lawyers for the trust would have requested a full accounting of all expenditures. They would have been exposed instantly. Forgery, embezzlement, fraud. They would have been ruined. Socially and legally. Canceling my wedding wasn't about their embarrassment over Ethan. It was never about my happiness or my choice of husband. It was about hiding their theft. They didn't sabotage my future out of snobbery. They did it out of pure criminal self-preservation. They were protecting their secrets, not me. I sat there, staring at the proof of their decade-long deception. The emotional neglect I had felt my whole life suddenly had a price tag. The favoritism, the dismissals, the constant feeling of being less than. It was all a deliberate strategy to keep me in the dark, to make me feel unworthy of asking questions. I slowly gathered the papers into a neat stack. The shaking in my hands had stopped. The hurricane of pain inside me had settled into a dead, calm eye. I felt a strange, chilling clarity wash over me. This was so much bigger than a canceled wedding. I looked at Ms. Carter, the woman my grandfather had trusted to watch over me. They didn't just cancel my wedding, I whispered, the words like chips of ice. They canceled their peace. The days that followed my meeting with Ms. Carter were strangely calm. The storm was gathering, but on the surface my life was still. I went to work, I had dinner with Ethan, I planned a future that felt both more real and more terrifying than ever before. Ethan, now fully aware of the scale of the theft, had moved past his initial rage. He became my anchor. He didn't push or pressure me. He just sat with me in the evenings, holding my hand while I stared at the copies of the bank statements, the numbers blurring into a testament of my entire childhood. He would make me tea and simply say, "Whatever you decide to do, I am with you." Deciding was the hardest part. Filing a lawsuit wasn't just a legal action. It was a declaration. It was taking a relationship that was already broken and pulverizing it into dust. It was choosing to be an orphan. There were moments late at night when the little girl inside me would whisper, "But she's still your mother." I had to remind that little girl that a mother doesn't steal from her child. A mother doesn't sabotage her happiness to cover her own crimes. After a week of sleepless nights, I called Ms. Carter. "File it," I said, my voice clear and steady. "File everything." The process was quiet, just as I'd wanted. There were no dramatic confrontations, no screaming phone calls. There was only the silent, official delivery of a legal summons. I imagined the moment the courier arrived at their pristine front door on King Street. I imagined my mother's manicured hand taking the envelope, her brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. I imagined her slicing it open with her silver letter opener, her expression shifting from confusion to cold, reptilian fury. I imagined my father's face paling as he read the words, "Olivia Reed versus Veronica and Charles Reed." The words themselves were an act of war. They responded, of course. Their lawyer, a man who smelled of expensive cologne and cheap ethics, sent back a letter filled with denials and accusations. They claimed the trust funds were used for my upbringing and elite education, that the withdrawals were all for my direct benefit. They painted me as an ungrateful daughter, manipulated by a greedy fiancé, throwing a tantrum because her wedding was postponed. They were building their narrative, the one they would tell all their friends at the country club. They were preparing to make me the villain, but Ms. Carter was unfazed. "Lies look flimsy on paper, Olivia," she told me over the phone. And they look even flimsier under oath. The court date arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It felt like a betrayal, that the world could be so beautiful on the day I was set to destroy my own family. Ethan held my hand as we walked up the stone steps of the Charleston County Courthouse. He was wearing his best suit, his jaw set in a protective line. I wore a simple navy blue dress, my hair pulled back. I wanted to look calm, serious, and unbreakable. We saw them across the grand, echoing hall. My mother, my father, and Grace. They stood together, a united front of denial. My mother was dressed in a Chanel suit, her pearls glowing at her throat. She looked like she was attending a charity luncheon, not a fraud hearing. But for the first time, I could see the cracks in her perfect facade. There was a tightness around her mouth, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she clutched her handbag. My father stood slightly behind her, his face a gray, stoic mask. And Grace? Grace looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Her eyes, so much like my mother's, narrowed into slits. She whispered something to my mother, who then turned her head and looked directly at me. Her expression was not one of anger or of sadness. It was one of utter bewilderment, as if she was looking at a stranger who had committed an unspeakable act against her. She looked at me like I had betrayed her. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The proceedings began, and Ms. Carter laid out our case with cold, methodical precision. She started with the wedding. She presented the forged cancellation notices, alongside a report from a handwriting expert confirming the signatures were not mine, but bore a striking resemblance to my mother's. My mother watched, her expression unchanging, as if this was all a minor inconvenience. Then, Ms. Carter moved to the trust. She projected the bank statements onto a large screen for the entire court to see. Line by line, she walked the judge through a decade of theft, $25,000 withdrawn on April 12th, for what the defendants claimed was home maintenance. In fact, it was for a custom marble island in their kitchen, Ms. Carter stated, her voice echoing in the silent room. She presented the receipt from the contractor. $50,000 transferred on June 3rd to fund a boutique for their other daughter, Ms. Grace Davenport, she continued. Gasps rippled through the public gallery, where a few society reporters were now scribbling furiously in their notebooks. She went on. The vacations to Italy, the new sedan for my father, the season tickets to the symphony, the country club membership fees. With every piece of evidence, my mother's composure began to fray. The color drained from her face. My father seemed to shrink in his chair. Grace stared at the screen, her mouth slightly agape, as if seeing the sheer scale of the deception for the first time. When it was my mother's turn to take the stand, she tried to maintain her air of aristocratic grace. She spoke of her love for me, her deep concern for my well-being. I was only ever trying to protect her, she said, dabbing a tearless eye with a silk handkerchief. The money was for her benefit. A stable home is a benefit. A successful sister is a benefit. It was a family fund, to be used for the family. Ms. Carter approached the witness stand. Mrs. Reed, she asked, her voice dangerously soft, did you ever at any point inform your daughter Olivia that you were using her trust fund, left to her by her grandfather, to pay for your kitchen renovations? My mother hesitated. It was a family decision. That's not what I asked, Ms. Carter pressed. Did you tell Olivia you were taking her money? I am her mother. It was my duty to manage her finances as I saw fit. So you did not tell her, Ms. Carter concluded. And did you tell her when you forged her name on the wedding cancellation forms? That was a drastic measure, taken out of love, to prevent her from making a terrible mistake. My mother insisted, her voice rising, the first crack in her icy control. The judge, a man with a stern face and tired eyes, had heard enough. He held up a hand to silence her. He looked at the mountain of evidence, at the bank statement still glowing on the screen, and then he looked at my mother. His voice, when he finally spoke, was colder than hers had ever been. Love is not a defense for fraud, Mrs. Reed. Concern is not a defense for theft. He delivered his judgment swiftly. He found them guilty on all counts: misappropriation of funds, forgery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Olivia Reed, he announced, his voice booming in the stillness. All misappropriated funds, in the amount of $152,000, will be returned in full to the trust. Additional damages for fraud are awarded in the amount of $75,000. My mother's hand, the one that had been trembling slightly, flew to her pearls. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked utterly broken. Grace turned away, burying her face in her hands. She wasn't crying from guilt. She was crying from the public, undeniable shame of it all. For the first time in my life, I had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending. The sound of the judge's gavel striking the woodblock was deafening. It was a sound of finality, the crack of a world breaking in two. In the stunned silence that followed, I just sat there, frozen in my chair. Ethan's hand found mine, his grip warm and grounding. I could feel the reporters in the back of the room rushing for the doors, eager to be the first to spread the story of the Reed family's spectacular implosion. The whispers started, weaving through the courtroom like smoke. Ms. Carter gave me a small, reassuring nod before she began packing her briefcase, her movements crisp and professional. The legal storm was over. Now, I had to walk through the wreckage. We waited for the room to clear. My father, looking older and more stooped than I had ever seen him, guided my mother out through a side door, shielding her from the curious stares. Grace followed, her face streaked with mascara, refusing to look in my direction. They were a portrait of ruin, stripped of their dignity and their carefully constructed lies. As we walked out into the main hall, the afternoon sun streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. And then I heard her voice. "Olivia." I stopped. I turned. My mother had broken away from my father and was walking toward me. Her perfect composure was gone. Her hair was slightly disheveled. Her eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. She looked smaller somehow, frailer. She stopped a few feet away from me, searching my face for something I no longer had to give. "Olivia, we need to talk," she said, her voice raspy. "This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. We can fix this. We're still family." The word hung in the air between us. Family. It was a word she had used my entire life as both a shield and a weapon. It was a word that meant loyalty, but only on her terms. It meant obligation, but only mine to her. It meant love, but only the kind you could display, not the kind you could feel. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see the powerful, intimidating matriarch who had controlled my world. I saw a frightened woman, a woman who had spent her entire life so terrified of not having enough status, enough money, enough control, that she had devoured her own daughter's future to feed her insecurity. Her life wasn't built on a foundation of love or integrity. It was built on a fragile scaffolding of appearances, and I had just kicked it out from under her. Ethan squeezed my hand, a silent signal of support, but he didn't speak. He knew this was a moment that had to be mine alone. "No," I said. My voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried across the marble floor with absolute finality. "We were a family, a long time ago, but you canceled that too." She flinched. It was a small, sharp intake of breath, a tightening in her shoulders. It was the exact same way I had flinched in her living room when she had called my wedding a circus. The symmetry of it was both tragic and liberating. She finally understood what it felt like to have something precious declared worthless. I held her gaze for a moment longer, long enough for my words to settle deep inside her. There was nothing left to say. There were no arguments to be had, no forgiveness to be begged for. We were past all of that. We were strangers now, connected only by a history of pain and a court order. Then I turned my back on her, and I walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't wait to see her reaction. With every step I took toward the courthouse doors and the bright, open world outside, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. It was the weight of a lifetime of unmet expectations, of trying to be good enough, of hoping for a crumb of approval from a woman who had a stone for a heart. The days that followed were quiet. The story was in the local paper, of course. A discreet article on page 3, detailing the lawsuit and the judgment. It was worded carefully, but the facts were damning. The Charleston high society my mother prized so much was ruthless. A scandal was entertainment, and the Reeds were the new show in town. I went through the motions of cutting the final ties. I changed my phone number. I deleted and blocked their numbers, their email addresses, their social media profiles. It was a strange, methodical process, like cleaning out a house after a death. Each click of the block button was a small funeral for a part of my past. Ethan was my rock. He knew that this wasn't a simple victory. He knew there was grief mixed in with my relief. He let me be silent when I needed to be silent. He held me when, one random Tuesday night while we were washing dishes, a wave of sadness washed over me and I finally cried. Not for the mother I had, but for the one I had never been given. "It's okay to be sad, Liv," he whispered, holding me against his chest. "You're mourning what should have been. It's the last piece of letting go." He was right. The lawsuit had severed the legal and financial ties. The confrontation at the courthouse had severed the spoken ones. But that night in the safety of Ethan's arms, I severed the final invisible cord. The one that had tethered my heart to a ghost of hope. The hope that one day my family would love me for who I was. I was free, and in the silence they left behind, I could finally start to hear my own voice. 6 months passed. The chill of autumn gave way to the quiet cold of winter, and then melted into the vibrant, hopeful bloom of a Charleston spring. The world turned, and so did I. The lawsuit faded from the society pages, replaced by new gossip, new scandals. The money, plus the damages, was transferred into a new account in my name, an account that my parents could never touch. It sat there, a quiet symbol of my independence, but the real prize wasn't the money. It was the peace. During those months, Ethan and I started over. We decided we still wanted to get married at Ivy Oaks Garden. It had been our dream venue, and I refused to let my mother's memory taint it. Reclaiming it felt important. It was like replanting a garden that had been trampled. This time, the planning was different. There were no binders filled with clippings meant to impress anyone. There were no stressful meetings or passive-aggressive phone calls. It was just me and Ethan, sitting on the floor of our apartment with takeout and a laptop. We made decisions together laughing. We chose a simple, elegant theme. We picked a menu of food we actually loved, not what was considered sophisticated. We made a playlist of our favorite songs, a mix of old soul and indie rock that would have made my mother cringe. Every choice was ours. Every detail was a reflection of us. The whole process was joyful, light, and easy. It was everything a wedding was supposed to be. I designed my own dress, a simple A-line gown made of soft, flowing crepe. I spent hours sketching it, and then I found a local seamstress who brought it to life. The act of creating it felt like I was stitching my new life together. Thread by thread, our wedding day arrived on a perfect Saturday in May. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees at the venue. The gardens were in full bloom, a riot of white roses, lavender, and hydrangeas, their scent hanging sweet in the air. Our guest list was small. We had 50 people, not the 300 my mother had insisted upon for my first wedding. There were no business associates of my father, no society friends of my mother. There was only Ethan's large, loud, and loving family, who welcomed me as one of their own from the very beginning, and my closest friends, the ones who had listened to me cry and had cheered me on as I fought my way back to the light. It was a wedding filled not with connections, but with love. As I got ready in the bridal suite with my 2 best friends, there was a moment of quiet. My maid of honor, Sarah, looked at me, her eyes misty. "Are you thinking about them?" she asked softly. I knew who she meant. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I saw a woman who was calm, who was happy, who was whole. The ghost of my family was not in the room with me. I had not invited them. "No," I said, and I was surprised to find that it was the honest truth. "I'm not." There was no father to walk me down the aisle. There was no mother to fix my veil. The thought, which once would have devastated me, now felt like a statement of strength. I didn't need anyone to give me away. I was giving myself freely and completely to the man I loved. I walked myself down that aisle. I walked slowly, deliberately, my eyes fixed on Ethan, who was waiting for me under the archway of blooming white roses. He was smiling, his eyes shining with tears. In that moment, he was the only person in the world. He was my partner, my champion, my home. He was everything they said wasn't enough, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he was more than enough. He was everything. Every step I took on that grassy aisle was a step I was reclaiming. Every smiling face I passed was a testament to the real family I had built for myself. This was not a circus. This was a sanctuary. We wrote our own vows. Ethan spoke of my strength, my courage, and the way I had taught him what unconditional love truly meant. When it was my turn, I looked into his kind, steady eyes and spoke from the heart. You saw me when I felt invisible, I said, my voice thick with emotion but steady. You loved me when I didn't know how to love myself. You are my quiet place in a loud world. Today, in this garden we fought to stand in, I don't just choose you. I choose us. I choose this joy. I choose this peace. And I promise to choose it with you every day for the rest of my life. When the ceremony ended and the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, Ethan pulled me close. The crowd cheered, but all I could hear was the beating of my own heart. He kissed me, and it felt like the first day of the rest of my life. As we walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, he leaned in and whispered, "You okay?" I looked up at him, at my husband, and a smile bloomed on my face, genuine and radiant. The weight was gone. The ghosts were banished. I was standing in the middle of my own happiness, a happiness that I had fought for and won. Better than ever, I said, and I meant it. In the months that followed our wedding, Ethan and I settled into a life that was beautifully, blissfully normal. We bought a small house with a yard for a dog we planned to adopt. We spent our weekends gardening and exploring the coast. My life was filled with small, quiet joys that, when added up, became a fortress of happiness. The drama of the past year began to feel like a story that had happened to someone else. I didn't seek out news of my family. I didn't have to. In a city as small and interconnected as Charleston, news travels. It found its way to me in trickles, through mutual acquaintances who would awkwardly mention something they'd heard, or through news articles I'd stumble upon online. The first domino to fall was Grace's boutique. Her business had been propped up by my stolen trust fund money from the start. Once that line of credit was cut off, and once the judgment forced my parents to liquidate assets to pay me back, there was nothing left to keep it afloat. The store, G. Reed Designs, held a massive going-out-of-business sale. A friend sent me a photo of the storefront, its windows plastered with bright yellow signs. I felt a brief, distant pang of something that might have been pity, but it passed quickly. Grace had stood by and watched my mother forge my name. She had smirked as my world was torn apart. Her failure was not my revenge. It was a consequence. Next came the social fallout. The story of the lawsuit, with all its sordid details of theft and forgery, had become a permanent stain on the Reed family name. My mother, who had lived and died by her reputation, was now a pariah. The invitations to charity galas stopped coming. Her friends stopped returning her calls. I heard she had resigned from the board of the historical society she had chaired for a decade. She had built her entire identity on being a respected member of Charleston's elite. Without that, I couldn't imagine who she was. My father's professional life suffered too. He was a man who relied on his reputation for integrity to secure contracts with wealthy clients. The word fraud is not good for business. Old clients became distant, and new ones were hard to come by. His firm, once a pillar of the Charleston architectural scene, began to struggle. They had to downsize, letting go of staff they'd employed for years. Their world, built on a foundation of my money and their lies, was crumbling brick by brick, and my only role in its demolition was my absence. Then, the phone calls started. Not to my new number, which they didn't have, but to my office line at the interior design firm where I worked. The first time the receptionist told me my mother was on the line, a jolt of ice went through my veins. "Tell her I'm not available," I said, my voice flat. She called again the next day, and the day after that. Finally, I instructed the receptionist to tell her not to call again, so the calls were replaced by voicemails left on the general office line, which my boss, a kind and understanding woman who knew my history, would forward to me as audio files, letting me decide whether to listen. For weeks, I deleted them without listening. But one day, morbid curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on the latest file. My mother's voice filled my headphones. It was a voice I barely recognized. The clipped, authoritative tone was gone, replaced by something thin and pleading. "Olivia? Olivia, if you're listening, please just call me. Your father isn't well. The stress of all this. Just call us. We just want to talk. This has gone on long enough. We miss you." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost pathetic. She didn't apologize. She didn't take responsibility. She was trying to use my father's health as a lever to pry open a door I had bolted shut. I deleted the message. A week later, there was another one. This time, it was Grace. Her voice was sharp, angry, laced with desperation. "You did this, Olivia," she spat. "Are you happy now? Our lives are ruined because of you. Mom cries all the time. Dad won't leave the house. You took everything from us. Everything! All because you couldn't handle a little criticism about your loser husband. I hope you're happy with what you've done. I listened to the entire tirade without a single flicker of emotion. The Grace on the voicemail was the same Grace who had smirked at me in the living room. She still believed they were the victims. She still believed I was the one to blame. They had learned nothing. I never picked up the phone. I never responded to an email. I didn't need to yell or scream or tell them how much they had hurt me. I didn't need revenge anymore. My revenge was my silence. It was my happiness. It was the beautiful, peaceful life I was building with Ethan. A life that had no room for their toxicity. They had built their lives on lies, and the simple, quiet weight of the truth had done my work for me. They weren't being punished by me. They were living in the prison they had built for themselves, and I was free. It's been 2 years now. Ethan and I have that dog, a goofy golden retriever named Gus, who fills our little house with an abundance of fur and joy. My life looks nothing like the one my mother had planned for me, and I am grateful for that every single day. After working at the design firm for another year, I took a leap. I used a portion of the money from the trust, my grandfather's gift, finally being used as he'd intended, to start my own business. I run my own bridal design studio out of a small sunlit shop in the historic district. The same dream my mother once threw away with my childhood sketches is now my reality. Every dress I create, every bride I help, feels like an act of quiet rebellion. It feels like freedom stitched into fabric. I help women create the happiest day of their lives on their own terms, free from the judgment and expectations of others. In a way, I'm giving them the one thing I had to fight so hard to win for myself. People who know my story sometimes call it poetic justice. I don't see it that way. I just call it peace. I've learned that the most powerful response to people who try to break you is not to shatter, but to build. You build a life so full of light and love that their darkness can't find a single shadow to hide in. Sometimes, walking away is the loudest revenge. It's a statement that you value your own peace more than you value their drama. It's a refusal to play their game any longer. My family is still in Charleston, living in the ruins of the life they built. I don't hate them. I don't wish them ill. I simply don't think of them at all. They are a chapter in a book I have already finished reading. If you've ever been told you're not enough, that your dreams are a circus, or that your love is inappropriate, please listen to me. Your worth is not determined by their approval. Your happiness is not a negotiation. Prove them wrong quietly. Build your own world. Stitch your own freedom. And if this story hit your heart, hit subscribe. There's always another story to tell. Another woman who turned betrayal into power.